Quiver, New Weapons for Thought, a post-Elysian political project that takes thinking to be an instrument of combat. Unapologetically queer, feminist, anti-capitalist, and abolitionist.
So, hi everybody, my name is Marta. I'm from Düsseldorf, Germany. Very nice to see you all and to speak to you and to speak about the two texts that we had for today about becoming woman. And I think it appeared, like the term appeared in a few discussions before. So it's really interesting now to get into it. And yeah, the love of the Medusa by Hélène Cixous. It's kind of, I guess, a seminal text of second wave feminism. And for those of you who don't know, so Cixous is also very good friends with Jacques Derrida. They're both from Algeria, and she was also one of the founders of Paris 8. The infamous university that Foucault and Deleuze and everybody else was teaching at. And yeah, so the love of the Medusa, I think it's a pretty interesting text. I wouldn't necessarily say it's super academic. It kind of reads like a manifesto, I would say, and maybe also a manifesto for becoming woman, what Deleuze and Guattari meant by this term. And we had only a small excerpt, but in the beginning she starts with the problem why she's writing the text, and she says, "I shall speak about women's writing, about what it will do." I think that's very interesting because I think it puts writing in a greater perspective. So what writing can do when women write, what can it do for them? What can it do for the world? But also going into larger practice. So what does it mean as a practice? And also what could it mean as, for us as intellectuals? I would consider us all like in this realm of the Quiver meeting. We're very much intellectuals, I would say. So I think it's very interesting to think about writing as a practice and what we can do with it. And in the excerpt we were reading, she starts with talking about the locus of marked writing. So like the male rational writing that we know from academia, from sciences. And I quote here, where woman has never her turn to speak, this being all the more serious and unpardonable in that writing is precisely the very possibility of change, the space that can serve as a springboard for a subversive thought, the precursory movement of a transformation of social and cultural structures. And then a little bit further on, she must write herself because this is the invention of a new insurgent writing, which, when the moment of her liberation has come, will allow her to carry out the indispensable ruptures and transformations in her history. And I think here already it starts to kind of tie back to some texts that we already read. So the ruptures sounds very familiar to me. We were already talking about them. And then in the paragraphs that come next, she also kind of draws up this image of a battlefield, a war, the woman as a fighter, especially when she starts writing herself. And I think in this part, I also want to focus on what she says about writing as a return to the body. So, or that writing will allow in this moment to return to the body, and not only to the body, but also to breath and speech. And this is also kind of, because she says individually, so women have to do this individually, because it's always about singular, distinctive bodies. So you have to really find yourself, not because she's talking about herself, so woman as herself, but it is about yourself. And actually, because this part of becoming woman always in the Gatari has a connection to the minor, so the movements, the kind of figure of the minoritarian and becoming minor. So becoming woman might be one aspect of that, becoming animal might be another aspect. And I don't know how many of you have read the Gatari's Toward a Minor Literature, the Kafka text, where where they try to figure out this way of minor literature by Kafka. And there are a lot of points in the Cixous text where I also find strong connections to minor literature. Might be also because it's about the same time, so they both are written around the same time, or published around the same time, 1975. And yeah, there definitely were contemporaries, and I guess kind of in the same bubble. But this problem of the individual body or the individual return to the body, to the breath and to speech is also something I would say you can find in minor literature, where they talk about or where they kind of analyze Kafka's way of writing and why he was doing it and how he was doing it. And there's an instance where they talk about an agent that becomes all the more collective because an individual is locked into it in his or her solitude. I think this is also something very interesting, because why would you want to write in a text where you are clearly speaking kind of to a collective issue and to something that you maybe would try to solve in a collective way, and then suddenly speak about the individual? But I think there's the specific instance in writing where you are always kind of alone when you're doing it, and also in your voice, but doesn't mean that it's not of collective value. And this is also something that the Gatari we're trying to figure out via the minor literature and Kafka. And then I was already talking about like this tying back to the war machine from A Thousand Plateaus that I find in Love of the Medusa. And there is a paragraph, so the second level where there's indispensable ruptures and transformations need to take place is also where you are seizing the occasion to speak. And she describes this as a shattering entry into history, which has always been based on her suppression, so woman's suppression. To write and thus to forge herself the anti-logos weapon. I think this is really nice that we are already talking again about weapon, because that is where the Quiver started, kind of. And it's kind of helpful to think about becoming woman in the aspect of the weapon as well. Maybe this part was like a little bit missing in the discussion we had about it the last time. But you can clearly see this movement one has to take in writing or speaking. Sorry, my cat is going a little bit crazy. Writing and speaking is like also this projectile movement that the Gatari were already saying about what makes a weapon. So how you can distinguish between a tool and a weapon. Also, I guess, writing and speaking, when does this change happen? When is it no longer a tool for example, make a statement. So I think this like logos that she was talking about and also the rationale, like the other writing that is not the women's writing, is kind of maybe a tool to make statements. And in order to make it a weapon, something else has to happen. And she describes it very clearly in this kind of force forward, this projectile that needs to happen also from the body, from the speech, everything else has to go in it, and the breath especially as well. But Cixous is not Deleuze and Guattari, and so I think there are some instances in the text where we could like, yeah, maybe stop a little and be like, okay, this doesn't sound like it can go in the right direction. There are a lot of like traditional phrases or stuff that doesn't sound too revolutionary, I guess. So this instance where she talks about that you have to become at will the taker and initiator for your own right, or for her own right in every symbolic system, in every political process. Because yeah, as soon as we talk about like entering into the symbolic, I think everything starts to be lost again. But I would also like to offer an idea about what would it mean to enter into the symbolic as that machinic assemblage of becoming woman. I think there's also kind of a folded movement of re-territorializing and deterritorializing. So if there would be a true instance of this like weapon-like writing, you could be able to re-territorialize in the symbolic for a moment, and as soon as you're there, start deterritorializing again. Because I would also say this movement always goes together in Deleuze and Guattari. There's always, because we know they're always talking about the danger of being captured, and you can't have the one without the other. So you have to re-territorialize to deterritorialize. And then there will be an instance of coming back again, like landing, getting captured a little bit. And then you have to use your weapon again to go against it. So this anti-logos weapon that she's talking about is also something I would like to see through the lens of minor literature. Because in this text, they're talking or they're saying Kafka's problem is a problem of expression. So it's not so much about language, like how you really have to be a word craft, or it's not about crafting language per se. It's about what you're able to express, your expressivity, how you are using expressivity, and how you are finding your own expression. And I would say this is precisely something that she's also talking about, the problem of expression as the anti-logos weapon. And she also speaks about the pain to speak as a woman in public, which is also something I find very, to say also dark Deleuze. So what Andrew gave us through his text, that we are more focusing on the pain and what Deleuze and Guattari describe in the struggle of revolution. And she's also referencing the pain. So it's not, although this text reads very joyful and ecstatic in a way, doesn't mean that it's not painful. And pain is always, I think, a good indicator in this process that, something is going right. Yeah, so what else do I have to say? So yeah, there are also, I know, there are a lot of like pictures that she draws up that I'm not too fond of. So one of them is the mother, so writing with the mother's milk in white ink. I don't know exactly. I think there's a lot of room for misinterpretation there as well. And I would like to interpret it in a different way. So, because she was also talking about love. So love is something that's important when having like a political aim in writing, I guess. So because there's the power of the collective right there. So you can't really I don't know, write from a place of hate is not the right thing, but I think she draws up the image of the mother precisely because there's something that we can all connect to an ideal love, or what kind of love we should have for one another and for the world as well. So this might also be interesting to see that the struggle that we are all trying, I think, to overcome, and the revolution that we all want to enter in our lifetime. It's not merely a political or economical revolution, but it's also environmental and social, and it's also interpersonal. So there are a lot of levels that maybe are important to reconsider. So I guess in a lot of leftist discourse, this element of love gets pretty lost, and it's not as important because it precisely has like this feminine touch. And that's why it's, I guess, as soon as you enter in this kind of discourse, the loving one, or the struggle about love, you're also maybe like stepping into becoming woman as like, an assemblage that you can craft for yourself. And then she also talks about the libido, which is not so surprising because she's also very influenced by psychoanalysis, as everyone else was at that time. And there we can also kind of, I guess, connect back to the desiring machine, or what kind of movement desire can generate for political struggle in this way. And this is not like superficial libido, I would say. This is not about like a sexual revolution per se. This is much more deeper. Where she says the libido will produce far more radical effects of political and social change than some might like to think. So we are already seeing a lot of branching out from traditional concepts of love and relationship styles in the last 10 years or so. Like non-monogamy is like en vogue and very radical. I guess we could analyze it now in this sense, from going from Cixous, that we are not very successful in making it as radical as it could be, or that something is missing. In this instance could be the becoming woman aspect in it, because we're still like kind of being captured by more rational or like old-fashioned, or like not female history, but another history that we all know so well. So there are a few problems there, and Cixous kind of helps us realize them or to understand them. And in the end, she goes pretty direct. She says, everything will kind of crash because the economy, and economy is in quotation marks, of her drives is prodigious. So it's kind of detrimental. It's too big, and it's not too big to fail, but it's so big that everything else will fail. I read it like that. And that's because the woman arrives vibrant over and again. We are at the beginning of a new history, or rather of a process of becoming, in which several histories intersect with one another. And there we also have the becoming part. So she already talks about it as well. She's not saying becoming woman, but she says that the process of becoming and the several histories intersecting into them are that which will bring forth a new history. Yeah, and we're also ending here with another picture of a battlefield, a woman as a militant, and that she's integral to all part or to part of all liberations. And then we have this discussion again about that it's not only the class struggle that's important in bringing forth the revolutionary potential, but that you have to split open the class struggle. And so all struggles, this also the sex struggle or the race struggle, spread it out, push it forward, and fill it with the fundamental struggle. So becoming a woman could also point us more to the direction of the fundamental struggle that would help us all realize the revolution that we are all so desperately waiting for. Yeah, that's basically all I had to say about this. Maybe in a discussion we can go a bit further on where you can see connections back to Deleuze and Guattari, where you had problems with Cixous as well, because there, I think, there might be some. And maybe I also want to say that I also read this text, or I discussed this text in a course I created around writing the surround, or writing from the surround being a term by Moten and Stefano Hani, so Fred Moten and Stefano Hani in the Undercommons, this little book that they brought out. And I think it's quite interesting to think about writing in an academic context where writing is kind of what we do for a living. So not me, because I'm not an academic, I'm a cultural manager. I don't have to do it anymore, I'm glad. But this is also what I partly struggled with in university, or why I left the university, because the way we were supposed to write and what we could do in writing, or what the field and academia per se wanted us to do with writing, was very difficult for me. And I think Cixous establishes like this line of flight to use writing in a different way. And it gets kind of difficult to do it like this in academia, because I would say it's not an academic text, it's a different text. So I would also really like to hear your thoughts about writing as a practice later on in the discussion, and what you struggle with and what you think we could do with writing, because this is like what we do in a revolution, right? So we also do other practical stuff, but it's always sad that in writing we are always, I don't know, kind of circling around the revolution, but not really using our writing to do something else than just serve academia. So that's that from me.
Great, we all did the reactions. Nobody said, well done.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for the thoroughness of and the energy that you put in there. I mean, there was so much to unpack with what was presented. I think for me, the way that I came into the text was, what have I done that I needed to express myself, even though it went against, I think, normative structures. And for me, making art was one of them, or making films or videos or even designs, and engaging with social, political causes to make group change. So I think for me, that's how I equated it. And I think for the last decade, I've been engaged with writing. And I think I'm more empowered because it's another community to basically convince on your core values. So I would love to hear more about, the tool, because it is a tool and it actually can be a weapon, weaponized. And I've seen it weaponized so much by faculty, um, uh, basically destroying students' lives and other faculty lives and then other people's lives because of that's just the way they can use this weapon. So anyway, my initial thoughts. Thank you.
I'm just going to hop in real quick because I have to get out of here. Martha, thank you for both picking the text and for that great introduction. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm looking forward to going back and reading this whole essay at some point in the next week or so. But it's one of those ones where you read like the first sentence in the selection, you're like, yeah, that's what I'm feeling right now, especially that feeling that writing is constantly in this relationship with rationality or something like that. The thing that I really took from it, or the thing that I enjoyed the most about it, was that discussion of the relationship between women's speech and the voice, and particularly song, which is something that I've always kind of felt is something I just haven't seen discussed, or something that I've been thinking about. For me personally, I think the closest I've ever sort of felt to that becoming woman experience is probably singing along to a Björk album, which just, I don't know, something about her voice, especially when she sings live, it just brings that out of me. So, but anyway, I gotta go. Everybody have a good day, and I'll see you next time.
Dana, can I say something? Hello?
Please do. We'd love to hear from you, Chloe.
Okay. I'm Chloe. I salute you from Greece. And before saying anything, I have the opportunity, before everything else, to invite you all in end of May, where Andrew will take the floor in the closing of our seminar about capitalism and schizophrenia. You are all cordially invited. You will discuss with Harry for the details. As for today, what can I say for that wonderful, that touched me very much deep inside. It was wonderful, Martha. But from the other side, as a psychoanalyst and a gender theorist, I have to express the tension that I have, that always have, between what is the theory of becoming woman, which is a big weapon in the hands of the third wave of feminism, and from the other side, and that is included in the Mille Plateau, and from the other side, we have the notion of the abolition of the nuclear subjectivity, and the three standardized molar forms are male versus female, object choice versus identification, and heterosexual versus homosexual. So when we treat those three notions, from one side we want to keep the force and the energy that becoming human gives to all of us, but from the other side we have to abolish the subjectivity that capture and distinct desire productions. So desire production itself is in psychoanalysis is something that treats these oppositions, these three oppositions, sex, gender, homosexual, heterosexual, and object identification, as the limits, as the end points of a continuum, along with desire travels freely. And that's the main point in psychoanalysis. So, what I always wonder, not only in theorizing, but in practice, in the work we do for educational or for sanitary reasons in the community of the trans people, I always remind myself, and I want to remind to everybody else, the quote from Deleuze-Guattari psychoanalysis, that in every synthesis of desire constitutes, in every synthesis of desire, we can delineate a point that whatever consistent man concludes the woman and many women and vice versa. So there is a point of vulnerability, a point that of bisexualism, a microscopic transsexuality resulting in everybody being a woman of a man and everybody being a man of a woman. So this tension is something productive. This tension between becoming a woman and being in transsexuality is something productive that today it's in the frontier of the struggle of the people to be emancipated from all those notions and finally, through psychoanalysis, be free to express themselves. Thank you very much. Indeed.
I see that I've got my hand up. Shall I go? Yeah. So thank you very much for that, Martha. And I think what I'm going to say is it relates to what you just said, Chloe. In terms of sort of context of bringing this round to writing more specifically, what I thought of when I was reading this discussion of the woman in poetry, sorry if I go a bit out of this section, I read the whole thing, but when Cixous talks about Kleist as being sort of one of these rare men who produced the woman, and similarly Jean Genet and people, I thought of actually an ancient Roman poet who I've read and written a little bit on, a fellow called Catullus, who thoroughly male, thoroughly within his own male world, but he does have this this woman he writes about. She's called Lesbia, and in a lot of ways she appears sort of in a way that breaks down the codes that govern how to present a woman in literature. And so this is something I'm exploring, that this is actually a presence of a woman. And so my question, my sort of theoretical question based on this would be, in Cixous and also in Deleuze-Guattari, what, if any, is the specificity of the woman who is, fleeing or becoming or escaping or whatever word you want to use? Is woman in this sense just the instability of the symbolic, the chaosmos, in which case is becoming woman actually any different from becoming animal? Is woman any different from not man? And or sort of connect to that, is there anything qualitatively different when woman appears in the literary work of a man versus when woman appears in the literary work of a woman, in terms of the starting point? Does this make any qualitative difference to the, in Deleuze terms, to the line of flight that is performed? So that's my kind of theoretical question. I'd be interested to see what anyone here thinks. Thanks.
Can I just cut into there? Great. Yeah, I'm thinking the same things, and I guess I would go the route of the problem of expression again. So what do you want to express when you kind of step into this realm of becoming woman? So I think a lot has to do with the intensities that you would like to come forward, or the expression that you want to have, the things that you are concerned with, and how you can say them, and what kind of effect they will have. And so it wouldn't matter like who writes this, what your gender is when you write this. And with becoming animal, it would be the same thing. So, but it's there's a different quality, I would say. So it's also, but it's always coming from the mode we're in now, the milieu that we're in now. So we are looking at this from the perspectives that we have. And this line of flight might be becoming animal, because we are thinking from the animal that we know, and this one is from becoming woman, and because this is a problem that falls into this realm in the time that we're now, and in the place that we are now. But from the other side, you might not have these distinctions when you would look like from a theoretical, like completely neutral place that doesn't exist. But I think it's very important also to think about what it would mean becoming woman as someone who doesn't identify as a woman. So what kind of, what do you have to gain from becoming woman, in a sense? So I always think, also when we read the term in Deleuze and Guattari, it kind of always is very abstract, so they don't want to say a lot about it, because apparently also they can't really say a lot about it, I think. They leave it to someone else. But then it seems like that a lot of people shy away from exploring what it would mean for them to become woman, or to do the becoming woman. And so it's also, I think, very interesting in this group, like for everyone who doesn't identify as woman, what it mean to them, and also for the women in this group, because you're not becoming woman just by being a woman. So there's a different kind of work you're doing. Like maybe you have a different connection to some of the problems, or the problems of expression especially. But it doesn't mean that anything you do naturally is just like automatically doing the becoming woman.
I find this is especially, I suppose, most obviously politically relevant right now, with the kind of the rampant transphobia that we've got pretty much everywhere. Because actually, in terms of sort of discourses in which we're often stuck, it's kind of impossible to answer a lot of things. You can say, well, people are people, and that's that. But we're actually talking about gender. I agree with you entirely, Martha, that the fact that Deleuze and Guattari sort of say that and then just leave really opens up a lot of kind of problems or antinomies that we need to address.
Oh, well, thank you. I guess I would say when it comes to becoming woman, I think a lot of what I can at least think about is kind of the idea of empathy and compassion, and the idea of kind of these definitions that are static and necessary in this type of capitalist system. And in my own experience, coming from a conservative Roman Catholic family to, I don't know, an academic / artistic person, I confronted those definitions as a child. But when you start progressing intellectually, my experience was fluidity. I didn't really see definitions because I didn't experience them until I had to confront them. And confronting them could be seeing violence toward women, violence toward different races, violence toward different understandings or different belief systems. And it's not only witnessing them, but you defending, right? You involving yourself in that system. And I think when I read some of the texts about becoming woman, I thought about my relationship to not only my mother, but also the feminine figures, both academic and I guess familial in my life, every trauma that they've had to overcome. Like when I think about what I overcome in my world, I don't have this physical violence that's imposed on me. I don't have this sexual violence. I don't have this, you know, I need to be commodified or defined or used in a way. And every woman that I have met, there's a fear that I've heard. There's a violence that has been imposed on their bodies or their minds, control. And I think, well, I mean, first of all, I go, wow, I'm in a privileged place because I don't have that violence imposed on me. But at the same time, I go, they have to be so much stronger to overcome a system that's so clearly about control. And then I go back to who's in control. And I think that's what, for me, the text started revealing. It's okay, if you're becoming your true self within a system, you know, now it's not about defining the system, but just enacting this type of process of defining who you are and seeing what you see, and then coming together as a group. And I think when you mentioned the universal aspect of it, I think I'm confronted with the idea of being born in a world of hatred and control. I wonder who's in control and what the motivations are. And in the end, with the idea of climate change or the idea of oppression, what's the point of all this if there's an end point? Not for the earth and probably not for the animals, but for the species. So anyway, so those are my initial thoughts.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Martha, for the wonderful presentation. That was super interesting. And thank you, Gustavo, for your contribution. Just picking up on what you mentioned about you know, learning from compassion, learning from affection. I think this is super interesting because I think we can see a tension, and this was also identified by Chloe and Charlie, between a more second wave kind of affirming women as a kind of a valued identity rather than a devalued identity, and a third wave which seeks to challenge the category, seeks to challenge women as a category in itself, as a very subjectivity. And in this sense, Cixous is resolutely in the first category. And what it's super interesting, what you mentioned, Gustavo, is also it's also present in writers like Marcuse, who argues that we can learn from the socially constructed. He recognizes as socially constructed, but he says we can learn from so-called women's attributes of compassion and of you know, kind of care in order to resist capitalism and to resist the strict competition and the kind of conflict produced by the system. It's also present in writers like Bourdieu, who sort of produce the same argument, again, learning from compassion, learning from affection. And I think this is very close to Cixous as well, right? And Martha, what you mentioned about mother as a figure of love is, I think, what it's trying to do, is it's trying to reclaim this kind of devalued position, devalued in traditional social terms, and affirm it, and so that it has value. Then on the other hand, I think that the way I understand the losing notorious becoming woman is less about occupying this social construction of a woman, these attributes, the positive attributes that we can take from this, not the passivity, but more the affection, and more about taking it as a starting point, because it is always a paradoxical position. The social construction of women has always been burdened by so much paradox, so much symbolic instability. You know, there's always these dualisms. From the one hand, the virgin, but also the whore. And then from the one hand, the one who keeps up the moral order, but also the one who can challenge it, you know, who is the danger to this order. And then in this sense, to occupy this contradictory place, or to pass through it rather, and through these contradictions, to kind of escape the moral subjectivity, irrespective of whether this moral subjectivity is out of a man or a woman. So in this sense, I would see becoming woman as more structurally aligned, as more in what Charlie said, pointing to the instability, the inherent instability of the symbolic, and then closer to a kind of a third wave feminism, which would reject, in the end, the very category of woman. And then this comes back to the very real debates going on today within feminism. and especially around questions of strategic essentialism, you know, Spivak's term, to affirm, like Cixous does, all these positive qualities of women so as to prevent women's oppression and to advance the women's struggle, or to take a more queer perspective and write not as a woman, but write against man and against woman as identitarian categories which oppress perpetual becoming, which oppress the permanent revolution of the psyche. And I think this is a very real dilemma, and I don't think this is I don't think there can be much of a synergy between the two. I think it's for me, I think it's a case by case basis to look at situations where the kind of structural constraints call for a more strategic essentialist approach to affirm woman's identity, and other cases when more of a problem is the very existence of genders, and then moving away from this essential, moving away from any essentialism. But I don't think these two are, for me, reconcilable. Thank you.
Jessie, I think you were next.
Did I beat you to it? Yeah, I guess just riffing off the last couple things. I'm sorry, I just want to check, is my sound okay? Okay. Yeah, when you were kind of mentioning Harris, this kind of like tension when we start to talk about like women are compassionate, we need to adapt these things, which I know no one's generalizing to that extent, but it does I get like very cringy when I start to hear that, because this is also like the labor that has been expected of women for so long, you know, to be the caregiving, compassionate, blah-de-da-de-da. And so there's, yeah, of course, hopefully we can become more compassionate, but yeah, there's that tension there. And I think I'm thinking back to Martha's comments about this, like, how do we form a new relation to the outside, right? Like, of course, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, like where it's the outside is not just this like another transcendent category or another representational category, but signals, as they write, the fact that we are not yet thinking, which I think is what Martha is like talking about in terms of these like modes of expression. So yeah, this conversation super fascinating to me because I'm teaching a course right now on environmental feminisms and social justice. And my students are in a women and gender studies program. And it's been interesting to try and involve this question of like feminism in relation to not just multi-species climate change, like, you know, all like non-human kind of trajectories, but really trying to get at this like this question of expression. And so yeah, I just thought that there was a nice tie between what Harris was saying, and I think what Martha's maybe trying to bring up, this question of the expression of not kind of pointing towards like a woman as a new transcendent category or a specific kind of woman, but thinking about that relation to the outside. Again, maybe where the outside, of course, is always an infolding of insides, which is where I'm trying to write a piece about this right now, where there is no outside and this like question of infolding. Yeah, those were some thoughts I had. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, I don't know, Dana, did you prepare the next text, the Hartman text as well? Because I didn't.
You know, I didn't prepare, but I have some notes, so I can.
Because I think like this discussion is like kind of naturally progressing towards this, because we're talking a lot about the violence and also like the I don't know, the essentialism of woman as category and the struggle that comes with it. But it might be interesting not so much to focus the struggle on the violence per se, but maybe like how women, or how especially like Black girls, Black women, trans women in this sense as well, are kind of inciting the violence. So why is it so problematic? Why is the symbolic order or the state or the police like so hard, yeah, in going against it or capturing these kind of intensities and the practice that goes with it? Because I feel like from my point of view, as someone who is identified, so the society identifies me pretty easily as female, and when I kind of realized like a lot in the cultural output, but also like in political output, we are always like, yeah, circling around these issues of violence against women. And I know this is also the case for Black people or POC, when you have the cultural output where you always are confronted with the violence against you. And that's like super interesting for narrative structures as well. Like these problems, they're always like the basis for a lot of stories that get told in our culture. But it would be so much more interesting to focus like on the forces that are like at the starting point where the violence like tries to stop these forces, like what they problematize in our culture and in everything that it's produced in it. So I think the second text makes this really clear, like what becoming woman could be, not like in terms of a women's struggle, but in terms of finding these instances, intensities, and forces that are so problematic and so dangerous that they are from all sides are trying to be put out. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and the discussion goes towards the second text. Maybe we can just begin to present it together with Jose, if you would like to. I mean, I can say a few things, and you can pick up from there, Jose, if you're okay.
Sure. Yeah. No. Please. After you.
Okay. Anyway, yeah, because I don't have I didn't present it. It is a very easy text anyway. I mean, this is a speculative history of Esther Brown. She's wild and wayward. I hope I pronounced it well. Well, what my first thought in the beginning of this part of the text was that her profile was presented a lot like very similar to the flaneur. Of course, without this upper class privilege, of the flaneur and the turtles and the Paris situation, but the wandering, the drifting, the non-working, the going to the theater, like a Black, less privileged flaneur in a way, but whose privilege was at the time the possibility of this wanderlust, or the possibility to be wild and wayward, at this wandering of this endless possibilities. And of course, there were many difficulties in her life, which made her also able to fight back, to support this attitude of hers, to have an attitude. She had experienced freedom. She was unstoppable, able to smash things up, a public threat to order and to moral decency. And she was what the text says, ungovernable. And there is a nice quote that maybe I could just read from the text. I think it explains it in a very nice ways. What the law designated as crime were the forms of life created by young Black women in the city. The modes of intimacy and affiliation being fashioned in the ghetto, the refusal to labor, the forms of gathering and assembly, the practices of a subsistence, and getting over were under surveillance and targeted by the police, as well as the sociologists and the reformers who gathered the information and make the case against them, forging their lives into tragic biographies of poverty, crime, and pathology. And of course, no one in the text, it's clearly stated that no one thought, nor would think that Esther Brown or any of these women, Black women, were radical thinkers, poets, doers, carriers of social change. But instead, they were demonstrating bad behavior. That was it. There is also the story with the encounter with the detective Brady, the detention of Esther Brown, the reformatory sentence that came based on the possibility, the likelihood of future criminality, and not on the existing, on the non-existing prior felonies or on the non-existing crime. And of course, that they were not the only ones. As Hartman also states here, all sorts of Black women would be arrested in order to be, let's say, saved from the streets on a whim or suspicion or likelihood. And the reason of arrest were loitering in front of a building or being too loud, leaving from a club with someone you just met, running, sharing a flat, having a lifestyle that had the possibility of a crime, and the official reasons were solicitation. And then Hartman says in the text that the real offense was Blackness. This was the criminal activity. And of course, Esther Brown had to defend her way of life in the women's court. She had to give an account of herself and to prove that she was not a threat to the society, that she didn't live the life of a prostitute, even if this wasn't her profession. She had to prove this. But the moral decency and the social decency would make it very difficult for her to prove that she wasn't a threat, as she was having sexual relations outside marriage, for example. She was not currently working, for example, refusing to work in the traditional sense that we had, that we know. And she was indicted for a vagrancy. And we also see further in the text in the next chapter that we don't have, it's not the whole text, the history of vagrancy since the 14th century in England, and how it was used as I don't remember the word. Maybe Jose, you can help me.
Yeah, the vacancy part. I guess Hartman puts it as it's a legal means to master the newly masterless. Is this what you were thinking in terms of vacancy?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, and that section in particular, because the essay, the excerpt that we read, Hartman actually expands on it and adds things to it in the book that she published, Wayward Lives. But the vagrancy laws in particular become especially relevant for the life of Esther Brown and kind of Hartman's critical reconstruction of this history. I mean, tying it to the Cixous, this is it's a way of writing, or writing as a critical kind of emancipatory practice for someone who didn't leave any writing. And so that's something that Saidiya Hartman will make will put emphasis on when she introduces again Esther Brown later on in her larger text, Wayward Lives, that Esther Brown didn't write manifestos, never kind of like took up public speeches or anything, but rather kind of sought to craft a form of life that evaded work and found other means of subsisting, because the types of freedom that's afforded there allowed her to be, a full human being, let's say. But the vagrancy laws in particular, with which our reading ended, are especially relevant because, at least in the United States, prior to the quote unquote abolition of slavery, they were the legal means by which people were allowed to, or informal groups of patrols were formed to try to find slaves, runaway slaves, and prevent the slave or the runaway slave as a phenomenon, because this is under plantation society, that'd be the loss of property, loss of profit. But the persistence of vagrancy laws after the legal abolition of slavery was used as a labor discipline measure, as a way of ensuring that the only means of subsisting or meeting one's social reproductive necessities or requirements took place via the wage and via the labor market. And so when Saidiya Hartman kind of alludes to or references Esther Brown as crafting a form of life whose very expression is deemed illegal or ungovernable, this history of slavery and the history of vagrancy laws is definitely in the background of not just Esther Brown, but everyone, young Black women like Esther Brown as well. Good. I think that's, thank you, Dana. That was a very, that was a very good summary. The only thing I had to add, or not really had to add, but was thinking about when Martha was giving us the run through with Cixous, is Hartman's methodology, what she calls critical fabulation, and a way of using the official statements and case files of institutions of power against those institutions. So perhaps we can see Hartman's methodology as constituting one aspect of this idea of writing as an anti-logos weapon. And again, I think this search for the outside, it actually, at least in the Hartman, it actually is explicitly thematized, where Saidiya Hartman says that the idea of writing this alternate history of Esther Brown, not from the perspective of institutions of power, but from within her own perspective and on her own terms, Hartman says is a thought that's directed toward the outer bound of what is possible. That to understand what the content or the type of activity, the habits, practices, and the desires of someone deemed ungovernable by society, if you want to understand that kind of desire on its own terms, it's a desire that's directed or oriented toward what is deemed at least impossible according to institutions of power, and deemed what is at the quote unquote outer bounds of the possible from the perspective of someone like Esther Brown. So that's, I think, yeah, that would be the only thing I would add to that. Yeah, Dana, do you have any last thoughts, or Andrew?
I mean, I think that question that you just brought up, Jose, is kind of the bridge that connects our two readings and sort of broadens out to our wider discussion. You know, famously in Anti-Oedipus, E&G collaborate with the anthropologist Pierre Clost, who, you know, writes this amazingly beautiful book, Society Against the State, in which he argues that that the real interesting history of people are the people who leave no history, you know, the people who refuse history altogether. And he doesn't say this in order to say that we all need to return to the form of existence that these so-called primitive people had, but to say that the fact that they lived without a state and without writing as we know it gives us a speculative possibility of living in the future without those things as well. And so I think it opens up this sort of interesting question that, you know, Martha was so wonderful at, but also Chloe and Harris, I think, opened up these sort of interesting sort of paradoxical elements of what does it mean to write? You know, let's say within the psychoanalytic or the schizoanalytic framework, they're pushing against what Lacanians would call the imaginary, which would be the binary opposition, me, you. It's deeply paranoid. It's tied to notions of identity. So they're already pushing beyond the imaginary, but that's quite easy to imagine. So it's getting beyond just the sort of male-female binarity relation, but it's also pushing beyond what Lacanians would call the symbolic as well. So, you know, which they get anthropologically from Levi-Strauss, where, you know, all of desire, the unconscious, is structured as a language within that order. And we can think that within gender theory or race theory as almost sort of like boxes, right? Where you go to a government office and you fill out a form and you have to sort of check the box. And it's not just one box and it's not this paranoid relation, but it's a categorizing move in order to make sure there's a system in which everything fits into place. And so it's not just a pluralization, which, you know, let's say a really kind social democratic state would make place for, where everyone gets their identity as long as you can make it intelligible, and certainly we'll recognize it for you. And so it means that what I think is kind of interesting about both Cixous and Hartman in this context is they're not as focused on the imaginary, though of course the sort of brutality and violence of these sort of paranoid, personal, on the street, the cop stops you, they call you out and you're sort of trapped, and then they, they frisk you, or they even commit sort of violence on you, and you get thrown down to another institution, and then the symbolic sort of starts grinding into place. Yeah, certainly that's the violence that they're interested in, but they're interested in the violence of that sort of linguistic, intelligible categorization as well. So it opens up the question, like, if you're also pushing against the symbolic, perhaps through writing itself, what does this look like? So I love Martha's move into the minor. Maybe the shorthand for the minor is to become a foreigner in your own land. Within a category of, let's say, identity, that would probably mean saying, even within, a woman's womanness, she would say, I don't really feel like a woman, nor do I necessarily know how to come together with other women as women in order to claim women's power, and we've seen the sort of revenge of that with Sheryl Sandberg, lean in feminism, the sort of like way in which sort of older modes of second wave feminism have become corporate feminism. They've become quite reactionary with, so-called radical feminism now being sort of like second wave women getting together with suburbanites, just hate on queer and trans people, So we've certainly seen a revenge of the symbolic in that way, I suppose. And so what does it mean to sort of get beyond all of that? Where does it look like? And so I love how Hartman in so many ways is a instance or demonstration of this sort of feminine writing, or this writing of the woman against the woman, where it says, what are the ways in which the symbolic failed, or we can get outside the symbolic, the institutional records that a mental institution or carceral institution has on these women that gives us only a very small archival sort of notion of it. Also knowing that, even archive itself is a word that goes back to the magistrate who controls the state through their civic and public buildings, right? So you get the archive, and the archive isn't enough. And in fact, you have to write against the archive, even when you begin with these archival materials. So what does that look like? And, I love the way in which Hartman does it. I think it's very similar to the way in which, let's say, James C. Scott did his infrapolitics, where he's looking to peasant groups and their folk songs as a coded, hidden cultural mode of resistance that people use. And someone like, what's his name? Race Rebels. He teaches at Robin Kelly. There we go. Geez, why did that take so long? That in Robin Kelly, he's got great stuff about how that worked as a form of labor resistance in the American South with Blacks as well, where they couldn't labor organize. Of course, it was illegal. They weren't even recognized as human subjects. And so you have to look at something like folk tales. But I think that this larger method question is still here. Is it enough to simply catalog folk tales? That's going to be a record of things past. Maybe that's still even too recorded. Is it enough to take the record and turn it against itself, kind of as Hartman's doing? That's interesting. Or are these still sort of retroactive things? And if we're going to make movement in our style and our writing, in which it enacts something, it's performative in the sort of classic case, what does it mean to performatively enact this sort of gender theory or new gendered perspective, this becoming, this minoritarianness that doesn't just validate or recover, but sort of is the thing in itself? And I'm sure there are plenty of examples that people here can come up with, but I would think that's sort of also a direction that we would want to explore on the topic. So anyway, sorry for a bit of a monologue, but I think everything's sort of piecing together quite well here.
Yeah, the only thing, that's great. Yeah, the only thing, what that made me think of was, yeah, what you paraphrased from Benjamin, that to side with the working class is to become a foreigner in one's own country. As his own version, or another way of it, or kind of elaborating what becoming other would be, what a becoming woman would be. That doesn't mean actually assuming or defending an identity group or assuming a certain subject position, but rather participating in whatever struggles for emancipation may arise out of that site of oppression, domination, and exploitation. But yeah,
Can I jump in? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Jose and Dana and Andrew. Picking up from some of the things Andrew said, I was really thinking about this notion of, writing as a space for becoming, as a space for escaping one's subjectivity. It's really prominent in Deleuze and Guattari. It's really prominent in Foucault. He said, to write in order not to have a face, undoing faciality. Deleuze and Guattari also, in the sense of writing so as to escape your own subjectivity and to endow and to enter all kinds of transformations. I think something that I thought of when reading the Hartman text was what they write about Lawrence and Miller, who were, of course, known to be very sexist. Even in the writings, this is reflected. But they say they're often, denounced for their sexism, but in their writing, they enter an irresistible becoming woman, which is not becoming woman in the sense of assuming a woman's identity, but in the sense of leaving this moral, this moral, in a sense, structure of opposition. So I think this is really interesting, but ultimately, how to go beyond. We've been talking about Hartman's writing all of this time, but I was really wondering, what about Esther's writing? What about Esther Brown's writing? And one of the things Hartman emphasizes is that Esther Brown never wrote something. She never produced a poem or a picture or a film. She could not do so. She only produced Esther Brown. She produced herself. And what this made me think of is kind of this, Cixous' call to write as a woman. What does this exclude? What does this focus on writing exclude? And for me, it's quite obvious that it excludes those who cannot write. I'm thinking here of illiterate people. I'm thinking here of people who are focused on, on subsisting, on surviving from day to day, like Esther Brown. But in this case, in the case of Esther Brown, something is still produced. This affective intensity of a becoming, of a change, of an overcoming, an escape, a transformation. This is produced by living, by experimenting with different styles of life. And crucially, this production, this affective intensity can then be taken up and implicated within other machines, and in this sense, artistic machines of writing, like what Hartman does. Hartman's text, which is great in its theory and it even has literary value, could not have produced these kind of intensities had not been for Esther Brown's intensities of living, which did not touch the array of writing. And here I'm reminded of Masumi. Masumi has this great introduction to Deleuze and Guattari. And he says, when he's defining a plateau, he says the point is to produce a kind of affective intensity that does not die down in the sense of, the Western conception of the orgasm, which just peaks and then falls, but to produce this plateau which survives you and which can then be taken up and plugged into other machines. And I'm thinking here of all great literature, which would have been impossible had it not been for the people surrounding it who produced affective intensities in living and experimenting. For example, would On the Road by Kerouac be possible without Dean Moriarty, his friend who never wrote himself, but who through his life and experimentation and behavior produced this kind of model which infected him, which drew him in an irresistible becoming and created this literature. The same with Hartman and Esther Brown. And I think this is kind of an interesting synergy between the beyond writing and the writing as a becoming. Thank you.
Martha has something? Go ahead. I'll follow after you.
Okay. Yeah, great point, Harris. Because I think it's like difficult to see, but Cixous also kind of says like writing is not writing that we know per se. So because it's also the return to the body, to breath, and to speech, and the song as well that we also mentioned already. And I think also with Kafka, it would be interesting to see maybe, that his writing wasn't also done because of the traditional need to write, or like the traditional wish to be an author. It had to do much more with living as well. So kind of similar to Esther Brown, I think. So because I don't think she necessarily was surviving. I think she was really living. That was also the problem with her. And I think we are all pretty much in survival mode a lot of the time, and it would be interesting to go into the living mode and to see what ways of writing we could have. So for some people, it would mean to actually write. For other people, it might be singing, writing songs, dancing as well, all kind of art forms. But I would also say, like, this would also go back maybe to the anti-work discussion that we already had. That a lot of the things we do in our everyday life that we also consider work, or that a lot of women are trying to frame as work in a kind of feminist struggle, like the housework and care work that we do. What would happen if we would consider them more in like this practice of writing in regards to returning to the body, to the breath, and to the speech, and like the movements that we do, the kind of refrain that evolves, and the territory that we can construct with it, and how we can do like this. Also what Dana said about the flaneur, you know, how this everyday movement can become this not oral history, but the history that is not archival, or the immediate history and the immediate production, cultural production that comes with it, that isn't put into words and writing or into picture or poetry or anything like that. Yeah, I think it's a pretty difficult topic, but I think writing still has a very important part in like the struggle that we're talking about, the revolution that we're talking about, because it is it has a lot of ways where it can be translated. So even for people who are illiterate or blind or anything like that, you know, it is kind of an intermediate device at times. And the act that you do when you sit down, like Kafka did, or also Cixous did, for writing, and what you do in the writing, then that is not necessarily what leads to the text. So there's also kind of like the disconnect. So of course afterwards, the two of them, Kafka and Cixous, and also Hartman, they had a text after they were done writing. But writing can also be without the product of the text at the end, I think.
Thank you. Just to kind of go off, especially the last few comments, I do think there's that tension of what is the importance of constructing or writing counter histories or counter archives when there is a disjunct between, let's say, Hartman's work and the life of Esther Brown. And it's interesting because this writing, especially when tying it back to things that we find in the Listen Let's Read, this type of writing or use of written documents or records becomes important to a certain degree, at least I think, insofar as it allows us to maybe constitute a plane of eminence that's adequate to our present. Because for Deleuze and Guattari, they're kind of, especially in what is philosophy, they're always thinking of or putting front and center the necessity for conceptual persona and the different conceptual personas for thought throughout different historical periods. So either the friend in ancient Greece or the other in modernity. And that these conceptual personas allow thought to reconstitute or to make the appeal to what's outside of thought, non-thought, or philosophy's requirement for non-philosophy to constitute its own plane of eminence. And so I guess the question, or something to consider or explore, is what type of plane of eminence can be constructed given these types of figures that are populating this kind of the non-philosophical or the outside of thought for the current kind of organization of global society. And then another thing I was reminded of, especially when you were referencing both Martha and Andrew about the function of writing. I was just reminded of Blanchot's kind of reflections on May 68 and the type of writing that was produced there. And Blanchot has this comment that during the events of 68, there will never be a book written about 68 because the statements that are produced during that period of upheaval are supposed to transmit affects and to hopefully further the becomings already at work. to hopefully continue, acting against the present in the hopes for a future time to come in this kind of Deleuzean sense.
There's a really interesting conversation we're having in the chat right now with Josh too, which is about this sort of almost politics of aesthetics problem as it was just all sort of presented, which is if there's a politics of people where they're not just their survival, but their life is built around a sort of unintelligibility or a maintaining of obscurity or of evading recognition and capture in a certain way, then what's the ethics of reproducing them, making them intelligible, appropriating their story, making it visible in certain ways, and this is something that I'm really interested in myself. It's something I was sort of dealing with my most recent book that I wrote, where to me, I think a lot of like Esther Brown, especially in Hartman's rendering of her, didn't have any political goals. Her life was the political goals, and they were never meant to, nor could they ever generalize into a collective, anything on a large regional, national, or global scale. And so it's sort of, that's not what we're meant to take from it either. But there are other groups that function with anonymity, that send communiques, that engage in subversive action. And for those groups, the ethical thing that I came up with is that the thing to do when writing about them is not to detail or describe anything about their personal lives or the specificity of the strategies that they used, because it'd be largely irrelevant. The context has changed, and it had very little to do with them as people. But it was to continue circulating the force of their actions, and not just the rhetorical force, but in some ways, the things that it was meant to inspire and motivate and continue. So maybe that is a bit of the way to get through this ethical issue of not just grinding up these sort of tragic moments of people who've been completely violently abused, who the most sort of ambitious thing that we can think of it. And, Hartman does it, at least in this essay, of, there being a prison revolt that doesn't work, but it builds collective solidarity between women who are able to scream and fight back. And maybe that's enough for them in that moment. But what do we do with this? Where do we go without just making it cheap or enriching ourselves? And maybe it's to figure out what it is about that life that they lived that we can circulate, that we can continue to circulate. It's not about documenting it. It's not about just sort of attesting to the fact of it. So I think that that's a sort of, it goes back to the logocentric mode that Cixous, for instance, is pointing out. We don't need to argue in a debate to win a point that there were Esther Browns in the past and there will be Esther Browns in the future. So maybe this is a good open question for everyone else here. What have we read or what have we seen that really sort of gets that force and continues to circulate it without just reproducing the identity, without just sort of trying to repeat that same person outside of the context in which they lived? What actually picks up the intensities or the force or the act itself? It could just be agitation and propaganda, which I love and I will always support, but I mean, I'm also a media theorist, so it could be all the ways in which people who experiment with form have done things like experimental video, propaganda pieces, agitprop, in which it's all about sort of working at a different register. You don't argue to persuade, you do to motivate, to capture people in this other way and push them forward. Maybe one example is the Fred Moten approach, which is, the thing that I love about Moten is that he's a poet and that he has this sort of virtuosic mode where only Fred Moten can do it. One could try and imitate Fred Moten, but you would fail and you would come off as a cheap knockoff. And so what he sort of proposes to people, I mean, I guess there could be critics who just sort of dig into what he wrote and you try and explain it for other people. Oh God, no better way to kill it. But is to encourage other people to come up with their own unimitable style. So you don't imitate him, you come up with your own style. And I mean, there's nothing more DNG than this, right? I mean, this is all difference in repetition. You're not trying to sort of repeat and imitate things, right? And so I wonder what it means to take Esther Brown and not so much explain Esther Brown, but then come up with your own style because you're so inspired and influenced on it. And so I wonder what it means to also take Cixous and take Hartman and not just do their project or imitate or repeat their project, but like what would each and every one of our own projects then be? Come up with a new style in which we could say that was our inspiration, but no one would know unless you told them.
I don't know if you know her, the artist Wu Zhang. Fred Moten is also frequently collaborating with her. And I think she also has this very idiosyncratic style of taking very complicated matter and questions and handling them quite beautifully. So there's this one, she does like magical, realistic documentaries a lot, which are very, very beautiful and moving, but I think they could also be only read in the context of contemporary art. So because she had this residency at Gropiusbau in Berlin and a big exhibition, and I think a lot of people can like go into the exhibition and just like consume art and say, yeah, that's a great work of art. I can see it's art. But other people will, for example, me, will go into this exhibition and I get something very different out of it, like not even like an encounter with an artwork, but with something else, with a possibility of style and expression that's very moving and also very inspiring. And this one documentary she did was, I think it's called The Whiteness. It's about a nightclub, and in the film, the nightclub becomes the narrator. So she gives voice to the club, and the club kind of tells about what happens inside and the people who are there, and all the beautiful relations that they have, the relationships. And this is also, I think, a great example of this kind of very personal style. And you could ruin it by critiquing it, I think. Or you could just like go and watch something and experience it and come out of the experience, be like, wow, what can I do that gives me the same sense of pleasure and belonging, and like that there's something I have to say for myself. So also from myself, so from my own self, crafting my own kind of revolution and looking into all the thoughts that I'm having and the things that I can do with them, and not so much despairing about that there's not like a collective revolution that I can join and maybe compromise a lot of the feelings and the ideas and the experiences that I have. But then there is also going back to this like kind of individual problem that Cixous is talking about, but also that Kafka was experiencing, that you're very solitary in this moment. And I think we always have to add this layer of community or communal struggle again. So not as a way to compensate, but more because there are different needs in us as well. So we want to have our own exclusivity and speak about the things and feel the things that are really deeply important to us. But then we also want to be recognized and talk about it and have this form of like someone else saying, yes, I know this, and we can share in this together. And maybe it's also not really antagonistic, but always adding, like the ampersand and the listenatory as well. So you have to add all these different plateaus as well.
As much as I find, both Andrew's proposition and Martha's elaboration super interesting, I also do think that there's something to example which can be completely powerful in transforming and in leading others. And not only the example of having a unique style, which then purports others to explore their own style, but also the example of specific lifestyles and specific forms of life and ways of being. So I found the Hartman text extremely powerful for the same reason that I find, for example, I mentioned before, Henry Miller so powerful, because it constitutes an example, specifically in this case, of the refusal of work, which can seem such a frightening and then foreign concept with so many dangers. But then to know that there have been others, and not only others in the abstract, but specific people with their own lives and some of the most marginalized segments of society, more so Esther Brown than Henry Miller, is extremely empowering. And actually, one of my friends who's been trying to refuse work for the past 2 years, he wouldn't have done it if it had not been for Miller. He was thinking about it for 3 years, and then finally he told me, if he can do it, I can as well. So although I think there's something very powerful to developing something unique and then purporting others to do their own thing, I also think that leading by example and prefiguring different worlds through lifestyles, and this example it does not have to be rational or logocentric. It can be example of the body, of desire, of ways of loving, ways of living, ways of getting by even, that can lead others to say, if they can do it, I can as well. And I think that, perhaps this is something that shouldn't be missed. Of course, when we're dealing with groups in fugitivity or trying to not be recognized, it gets much more complicated. But yeah, that's just some thoughts.
I'll chime in. I mean, I think that it's useful to think about these scenarios of, let's say, creating, taking a model, but also just inspired to do something new with it. It reminds, the way Andrew set it up, I thought about research, scientific research, that construct, or like humanities research, like, hey, you're going to look at these examples, but make sure you make it your own, and then you publish those findings, blah, 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 blah. But the useful thing about looking at the new is that you're, quote unquote, the new, is that you reference the model previous, but then you interrogate the strategy and the methods that you're looking at currently and why it's effective or not, if that is a part of your process. If you're going through the performative aspect of just doing it to see what the results are as an artwork, then that's a different thing, and that's more ephemeral. And that could probably be more of a model of resistance. It could scale, authority couldn't identify what the power is, depending on your name or your status. It could lead to some more deflection or resources that could help you. I think that's kind of how I would assess that. When it comes to the idea of looking at alternative futures or kind of inflicting this type of change, currently I'm in a group called SANS, and my role in it was to collaborate with ecological artists and this researcher from Harvard to actually propose climate policy to the Biden administration. So we have a meeting in 2 days. My role was to understand what all this was. What is climate and why is it important, and why are people at risk important? So we all had to sign it, but we're all this anonymous blob. And a lot of the discussion was, hey, Mr. Harvard, we need to have your, quote unquote, symbol of power. And everyone else are just a bunch of artists and, good, strong people that could make a difference. And I think about that in kind of as a performative act. You really don't know who's there. You don't know if you're the son of a super billionaire or not. It's just this ephemeral thing. But there is a consideration of change. There is energy that's brought to that effort. And there is this other kind of tertiary network change. Like I've been talking about this idea to many, many other communities, and they're all in agreement, but they're confused on what to do. So when I think about Esther, I think about, wow, there's an example of a work that is reflecting a contrast to this society, a sort of resistance. And it's so clear that why aren't the viewers doing something about it? Are they comfortable? Are they not safe? Like, what's going on? And I put myself as kind of this camera, this documentary camera where I'm observing everything and going, why is my life so static? Is it because I need to be safe? Or I don't really know who to approach for change. So anyway, thank you guys. I'm riffing off of what you guys have said.
I think that final note on sort of what it takes for change is really present here, because in some of the contexts in which I know some of you, like, let's say, anarchism, there's been this long debate for a number of decades over what's been called lifestyleism, and the Murray Bookchins of the world and the platformists have all said, you don't have enough structure, you're not having enough meetings, you're not coming up with enough proposals, you don't have enough planning involved, right? And what I think we get with the readings for this week, in particular the Hartman, is a theory of change that actually works quite well with a lot of the other readings that we've been doing for weeks now, but that it's not about constituting power, which is to say, to write a constitution-like document in which its authorized force behind it is either, the voice of the king or the will of the people or anything like that. And it's not just a, if we disrupt everything enough, then the things we don't like will disappear and all the good things will remain, right? Which I guess sometimes people would call like a naive Rousseauianism or something like that, because that assumes that there was an idyllic state of nature in which the balance got disrupted by the arrival of evil people with their monopolies and their institutions, and if we throw them off, then we're back to everything. And instead, we get a deep and a long tradition of a lifestyle, in part through Black and queer ways of life. And I think that's what's really important here. One could miss that and just be like, okay, ways of life in general. But I think in particular, what Hartman gets at is a Black way of life that is partially forced, it's partially required. And it's not precisely Black in the sense of like African American. It can also be people who have been enslaved in a variety of different contexts. It can be people who have been forced into other, let's say, neo-feudal arrangement. I don't know. I don't want to explain this in too much depth because it'll ruin the neat parallel. But that there's a sort of anti-Blackness, which is when people are not allowed full inclusion within civil society, which is to say recognition by institutions, entitlements that come from citizenship or residency, any of that sort of stuff, that they have survived and thrived. They have found ways of life without the formal institutions that we are told are required. And then there's also the queer approach too, which is that there's an element of style and concealment and subversion and scrambling the codes, and that you can, raise aesthetics to a level of life. And so through using these as a deep cultural resource that goes back centuries, and if not much longer, we can see that actually, in fact, lifestyle is incredibly important. And those who diminish lifestyle as a form of social change, they themselves are very narrow in the way in which they constitute social transformation, and that they are limiting themselves to a very specific approach. And so what I love about this is that it really gives new ammo to like the lifestyle debate. And I think it really bolsters an approach that latches into things like aesthetic revolutions. We know what an aesthetic revolution looks like. It doesn't mean that an artist storms the Whitney and suddenly, you know, they're the next big artist. I mean, it happens occasionally, but that's the like Leninist, you know, approach to all of that. There are other aesthetic revolutions that happen in completely different contexts, in which it's an accretion, a mutation, a subculture, another group, and that they're not just looking to make small reformist things either, you know, nor are they incrementalist or just chipping away, but we get these other models for social change. I think it's ultimately a big part of the D&G project as well, to think of like, what are the models that we see for everything, and what can replace sort of very strict state models with, in order to get other models that we can move from one sphere to another. How can we see changes in aesthetics suddenly look like changes in politics? Or how can we see changes in gender suddenly be a different way for how we think about the alternatives to institutional thinking or something? So anyway, sorry, I sort of went on a bit there, but it's sort of what I'm seeing right now.
No, Andrew, you bring up a good point of the idea of looking at models or seeing the entire picture. You know, I was thinking of what would be a good art project. Well, probably figuring out how to do that, those two initiatives. How do we see society as different models? And what are the models that we currently see? And what are the models of change? Even through these philosophical texts, like would it be in a drawing? Would it be in a, I don't know, in a composition? What are those things? What are the forms of resistance? Because I think most of my dealings, even talking about this text with the people around me, they're like, are you calling me a racist? Are you calling me a classist? Are you calling me this and that? And I'm like, no, I'm not doing anything. I'm trying to expose you to these wonderful ideas that challenge who I am as a human being. And then I go, wow, we're not even talking about the same place. We don't see the ground the same way. And I think a lot of that, you know, the language problems deals with probably is a huge obstacle. Why don't we get to solutions? So is there a visual solution, an auditory solution that is beyond language? You know, we can't go beyond symbols, but I don't know. So that's what I think what I come up with now is, you know, there is existential issues now, and we do need to come together as a global, I would say as a global team. And how do we do that with all these problems? And I think if, you know, I think Dana, I heard that you guys were, you know, under curfew or something. And it reminded me of, you know, the idea of there's violence toward, in my community, when I was in Los Angeles, we were not under curfew, but I heard about the curfew of the riots. And how I guess the white elites or the people that had property were like, oh my God, my property is going to be destroyed. And I'm like, well, but what about the people that are killed? I think that the people that are killed are more valuable than the property that you have, because you can rebuild property. You can't rebuild people. And why don't we lead all policy that way first? Why is that so radical? So anyway.
Also, I would, is there anybody else that wants to talk? No. Okay, I'm free. Very nice suggestions, Andrew. And also, I really loved this to lead by example of Harris, and also what Josh was writing about how to seduce. But also to me, another suggestion, what would be important for me is to work towards ensuring visibility of theories and of possibilities, like the dissemination of knowledge in a way. I mean, I believe in spreading and in explaining or making accessible, offering knowledge, because I believe sometimes it's lost. And I believe that that if they become visible, if ideas become visible, they're also very easily adopted by others. And as an artist, I have done this with technology many times, but also in other ways, like teaching or talking. You know, I believe that if it's open, if it's out there, then people are more eager to adopt them, to search about them, to believe in change or in various ideas and theories.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, one idea that a few of us were bouncing around were to maybe begin a writing project that would be open to anyone to participate. You know, we'd have to figure out what the editorial process would look like and how it would occur. But having people write very short entries in a sort of classically kind of experimental style, almost like a encyclopedia or dictionary of whatever weapons for thought that you have, that you like, that you want to spread, that you want to offer to other people. And I don't think the text itself needs to be that internally consistent. Like, I think that there can be a lot of things that are paradoxical or even, you know, can't be used together all at once. But I think that as a resource completely, let's say, you know, 150 to 250 words per entry, we just see how many we can collect and decide what we want to do with it. I think that would be really wonderful. And it would allow everyone to have their own sort of signature, if you were, you know, where you can sort of make your contribution and it could be on your own terms and be in your own sort of space and style. And that our purpose wouldn't be to make them all the same. You know, maybe we'd first host them on the website or something, but maybe it could become a zine or a chat book, or if we get enough, maybe even a small entry of a book that we could publish with the press that we like, hopefully also with a free and open access version, but also maybe physical print copies in the end. I mean, that's the sort of project that I really sort of love and live for. It could be a great way to sort of allow these conversations to spill out into something that can sort of remain around and circulate in a different way. Does that interest people? Do people have ideas or suggestions? Yeah.
I think Dana brought this up once, the idea of maybe recording or doing something with sound. And because I think the text is also heavy. I guess for me it's not, but sound or adding kind of a flavor of what you wanted to say. And there are open source tools out there that could definitely lend to that. And so that could create atmosphere, I guess. But anyway.
I think Andrew's proposal is brilliant. I really like it.
I love it too, and it's good. It's going to spread many ideas. It's not difficult to write a small text with our ideas, different ones, our weapons, or I think it's brilliant. And of course, Gustavo, you know, we can do other things as well. Of course, we can also record. It's, I mean, we have other meetings. It can be something that is open for a print version. Of course, it would be difficult to include sounds, but you know, for the online version or for the site, it's something that they could be incorporated, I guess, as well.
Yeah, Dana, I'm working with MIT Press Leonardo, and they have something called PubPub, and they're moving to an open source access model, where you can actually embed a website's audio and video and even three-dimensional spaces there. And that's an open peer review model as well. So we could actually use that platform, and actually whoever we want to invite to edit will edit. But I think that's who I've been in discussions with. So depending on what the structure is, I can approach the editor and see if there's either like looking at a special issue or something that we want to focus on. Anyway.
Great. Wow, a lot of ideas today. A lot of plans.
We also have a very large subscriber list. I think it's almost 400 people now. So I bet that I've received, or we have received, a lot of emails from people who said they can't make it for one reason or another to the weekly, every other week discussions. But I would imagine that if we structured it well, we could have other people participate in this written mode and really get quite an excellent selection of things.
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to say thank you for the selection this week. Like I got the vaccine, I guess one of the vaccines, but I talked to my relatives in Colombia, and a lot of them are in, I guess they're in bad situation. So then I think about, I think I go back to, again, the idea of how does one country monopolize, destroy, and organize the rest of the world to what ends? And I see this group as a way to make me really think about these institutions of power and the purpose. And I posted a few references that I listened to and over the weekend, and one of them was about the idea of tax law and law being skewed to disenfranchise a certain type of race or lifestyle. So what if we radically rethink law, or rethink something that fundamentally hits everyone? You know, even the idea of food, you know, sustainability, you know, all those things. So the group has been really useful for me, because then I go to these individuals with power and I go, hey, have you thought about this? And they all are in survival mode. Hey, we're trying to keep our institutions afloat. We don't want to fire everyone in our team. I need to, you know, go on sabbatical. Or, hey, you know, my family's falling apart because I'm too obsessive as a researcher, et cetera, you know, all those things. But with all the chaos, I believe that a few group of people can do so much. And so, you know, a lot of these things that we talk about have been, I'm trying to formulate an international school for architecture with another group called Digital Futures World. And the main motivation there is to have free education to reach all over the world, putting out there free and open access. And to me, this is this effort. It doesn't have that name, but it is that effort. So I wanted to thank everyone.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool that we were able to attract someone who I think has a much different orientation than some of the anarchists here, who would never want to be in a room with any decision makers. And so it means that, you know, it sounds like you're proposing something to the Biden administration in a few days, and there's going to be a little spice of this group within it. And that just really tickles me. Because sometimes, you know, I do get invites to be a part of groups like that, and I turn them down. I'm just like, no way, I don't want to talk to you people. So to have someone who's willing to do that work, I think that's it really it does something interesting and new for me. Yeah. I know that next week, or well, in 2 weeks, Harris is going to be presenting it was Todd May again? Yeah. Some Todd May. Is there anything you'd like us to pair with it for the other reading?
I hadn't thought about that. Not sure. Let me have a think, and I'll email you guys. And if nothing comes up, I'll email you again for you to pick something. Yeah,
Great.
It will be on the tactical versus strategic distinction.
Oh, wonderful. So should the theme be strategy?
No, it's yeah. So the way you use
I
it
guess.
is the one struggle versus the many
Yeah.
struggles, and and less about how you go about it, and more about how you conceive the social. So maybe complexity. Maybe what it really resonated when we're reading Cixous. It really resonated what she says, to move away from the class struggle and look at multiple axes of oppression, multiple lines of struggle, to pluralize, perhaps.
I mean, should we do that a section from that Desserteau text on tactics versus strategy? Would that be good?
Yeah.
Very nice.
And then we don't have anything lined up for 2 sessions from now. So if anyone has anything that they want to really get in the mix, I mean, I think we keep sort of delaying this sort of Fanon thing. So maybe moving to Fanon in a few weeks might be a really great sort of turn. So I'm sure there's just tons of interest. Maybe pair it with some other anti-psychiatry texts. There's another reading group going on right now by a project called Unsound Mind that I've attended one of the sessions for that I find really amazing. I mean, it's someone who's basically going through the old history of psychiatry and all these psi institutions and the rebels within it to try and either change, transform, or even take it down, as well as radical alternatives to it. So I think maybe actually getting Sasha from that project with us would be really great to sort of move things forward. So we've got some great weeks coming up. Let's all thank Marta for such a great week, great text, great introduction. Thanks everyone for joining us. I mean, it's always such a pleasure. If we feel like we're dwindling in terms of numbers and we want to get more energy or excitement, we can do a sort of larger promotional push. Right now, I haven't been doing it. I've just been sort of emailing the group pretty regularly. So, you know, if people are feeling any particular way, let me know and we can make that happen. I'm also a little behind on some of the YouTube and podcast stuff. I've actually been having some problems with my eyes for the last few days. And so I've just really not been able to be in front of a screen nearly much at all. So I'll do that soon. I also wanted to check in with people about, you know, the section of our last session where there was the sort of stuff that spilled out from the chat. I was thinking about just sort of cutting that from the podcast to keep that a private conversation rather than a public one. But if people have really strong opinions on that, just let me know. Anyway, it's lovely to see everybody, and thank you so much for showing up every time, and you know, amazing contributions in the chat and the video and everywhere, and it's something I really look forward to every couple of weeks. So I'm so much looking forward to the next session, and sorry, I'm probably like dragging this on, aren't I? So
Thank you. I put the initiative that I'm on for everyone to review. So, you know, I'm not saying that I'm an anarchist or whatever. I'm a pragmatist. I want to help people, as many as I can. So you guys have helped me a lot. So thank you.
Thank you, Gustav, and thank you, everybody. It is a pleasure to see you every 2 weeks.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining Quiver. For more, visit our website at ourquiver.org, where you can RSVP for future events and see readings. We also ask you to subscribe while you're there to our newsletter. Till later, Quiver.